Hi everyone, my name is Jeff McAlpine, aka Mr. Mac. For a long time in Nevada, I was known as the PLC guy until we discovered whiteboarding, and then I'm, pretty much known as the whiteboarding guy now. And that's what I'm going to be talking about over the next year or so. Once a week, I'll release a tiny little video kind of walking you through the ins and outs of an instructional technique that we discovered. When I say we, I'm really talking about our biology professional learning community at Mojave High School many years ago now, where through professional learning community techniques, we created an essential curriculum, we created our own formative assessments, and then every once in a while we would give a common assessment and compare our results and figure out, okay, whose teaching met the needs of more kids, and who got a bigger bump or a bigger decrease from test to test to try to figure out what works in the classroom. It's a brilliant way to approach instruction and learning, and I give Rick DeFore all the credit for that. This is just sort of an introduction to where this whole thing came from. We really start with the beginning of my career, and I thought that the best way to change education, to get more kids to learn in our most demanding schools, was things that happen outside the classroom. That I was doing a good enough job comparatively to other teachers, that I needed to concentrate on things like leadership, science Olympiad. If we just had more dances, more fun, if kids just loved, enjoyed coming to school, then that'd be great. And also, that didn't really work too well. We found that our kids that were highly involved stayed highly involved, and our kids that weren't, they didn't get highly involved either. So outside the classroom didn't have that big of an impact. Then you go to the next level up. Later in my career, I thought, okay, that's not working, so maybe it's a what I'm teaching. So then we start to look critically at the what of teaching. What are the worksheets? What are the handouts? What are the PowerPoints? What are the videos? What are the projects? And then you sort of mess around with that, make the lesson itself, the what of the lesson, more sticky. I started to do things like turn organelles and cell drawings into cartoons, and kids loved that, and it was wonderful. But I can't say all kids learned. Still at this level, I'm hovering around the 50-60% on my assessments. There's a whole half of the students that while they were learning, they weren't learning like I wanted them to learn. And we still play around with the what of teaching a lot, and professional learning community work does that in teams. But the what of teaching, there's programs out there, there's books out there, there's resources out there, there's too much out there. And we've been changing the what of teaching forever. With Common Core coming in, we have a whole new what of teaching. And it just doesn't seem to be meeting the needs of half of our students in our neediest schools. So then you can go to the third quadrant of change, which is macro design of lessons. So these are things like components of an effective lesson. Now that was the standard Clark County School District thing, was components of an effective lesson. I sort of branched out from that. I did a lot of 5E, explore, engage, those sort of designs. A lot of explicit problem-based learning, project-based learning, explore at your own pace and level. One year we even tried a layered curriculum where kids chose, what they were doing at what time. And same sort of thing, the test score stayed about 50-60%. And that goes to our graduation level. It's about that. So those three didn't work. But you can see the progression of a career, and I think that's how things tend to happen in a lot of careers I've seen, in that we start with, okay, outside the classroom, then we start thinking about, what am I teaching? What do I need to change? Then we think, it's the design of the lesson that needs to change. And if you're lucky, you end up at the point where we ended up with as a professional learning community, where it just wasn't working. And there's another thing that we can change in classrooms, and that is the micro-level learning experience. The moment-to-moment interactions between teachers and students and students and students. And that was really where the change needed to happen. But we didn't realize it. You can't blame us. I've been in hundreds and hundreds of classrooms, thousands of hours of watching instruction, teaching, and it's all pretty much the same. The micro-learning is teacher talks, students listen, students copy notes down. Occasionally you have a class discussion where there's raised hand, one speaks at a time. Every once in a while you'll get some cooperative learning structures or activities. I've got my cooperative learning ninja shirt on now. I mean, that's a really big one. But very rarely do you see a consistent outside-the-box approach to micro-learning. Just to get more specific on what I mean by micro-learning, micro-learning is a lot different than the macro-level design. So, for example, let me just take an introduction. Well, let's go to the basic 5-step lesson that I started with, which was start with an introduction. And I designed amazing, engaging introductions. Kids wanted to learn what was in the lesson. Well, half of them at least did. It was designed well. There were great little video clips and pictures, and we would act things out. We would sing songs. We would be goofy. I mean, one of my introductions involved sock puppets singing "Everybody Poops." Who doesn't love "Everybody Poops"? I would wear costumes every day. I mean, my introductions were beautiful, but they didn't work. They got kids excited about the introductions. But when it came to learning, it was still, okay, traditional sort of approach to our micro-learning. One kid talks, kids copy, unstructured group work. Even though the what was solid and the macro design of the lesson was solid, the micro-learning wasn't there. That's really why we stayed at our 50-60%. When I went to the turnaround and we started doing PLC work, I wanted to raise my scores. And once upon a time, I had bought a class set of whiteboards and did a couple activities with it, and I liked it. I didn't have PLC at the time, so I had no idea if that bumped up my students' learning until we started doing professional learning community work as a biology PLC. And I did a little bit of whiteboarding and noticed a bump in my scores. My scores increased more than they had in the past, and comparatively they increased to everyone else. So that's interesting. Okay, well it was a slight bump, so let me use whiteboards more. And I used them more, and there was an even bigger bump. And then I used them more, and the bump stayed about the same. But we're talking up at the 65, 70, a little bit above 70 now. And okay, we're discovering something here. So we discovered that if we use these particular whiteboards in a certain way, they can give us bumps. Doesn't mean they're going to work all the time. There has to be a very specific way of using the whiteboards. And that's what we spent a couple of years figuring out is, why do we get bumps with this? We've changed our micro-learning so much to the point where we only used the whiteboards for response. And you might think that's crazy, but does it sound crazy when I say to you, yes, I really enjoy using the raised hand activity in class? Yeah, I use the raised hand technique. I use the technique where kids sit and listen while I talk. I mean, that sounds ridiculous. Well, why does it sound ridiculous when I say we use whiteboards all the time? We didn't put them away. They were our method of response. All the kids were responding all the time. And we didn't really need raised hand. If we're talking at kids for way too long, we lost them. But when they had to respond all the time in different ways, in a very specific way, in a specific pattern that we discovered over the years, our scores increased. And we got up to the point where I'm talking 95% of our students mastered our short cycle assessments. Now, our short cycle assessments, because we were a true PLC school, were designed by us, and the curriculum was designed by us. So the question is then, does that translate into the state test scores? And that's the one thing that PLC really helped in our department was people saw my scores going up, and soon everybody had a whiteboard everywhere. And we were experimenting with different methods. And what ended up happening is over 3 years, our scores on the proficiency test in science went up 68% in just a couple of years. Now, I don't attribute all of that, of course, to our discoveries, but at the same time, it's a significant bump, And if you look at what was the major change we made, it was the micro-learning of our lessons. It wasn't that everybody started doing more labs or everyone started doing more projects. It was that more kids were responding more of the time in specific ways using that very visible white square board. All right, so that's sort of, in a nutshell, the beginnings of whiteboarding. Next week, I'm going to talk a little bit about what we discovered for what actually makes whiteboards work, a little bit of the research behind it. Just to preview it, please understand we didn't design whiteboards looking at research. We designed this technique, and then when we found out it worked, we looked for the research that said, why the heck is this working? But I'll talk about that next week. All right, thank you for listening. I really appreciate your time. Hope you got something out of this. There'll be a lot more practical talks later on when I start going into the tools and techniques and methods that are pretty exciting, and I hope you get something out of it. If not, feel free to ignore these videos. I completely understand. And have a great and a wonderful first week back at school.